right, so these are your notes for chapter 8. And again, to recap some of what we've already covered. In chapter 8, we deal with African civilizations. Is it fair to deal with all of Africa as one common unified place? No, it's not. And why is it not a good idea? Because it's stupid. And I can't believe I'm actually recording that part, but that's all right. If we get any phone calls, I'll change my name. All right. So some of the things that we're going to do to start are the same things we do every time. We're going to look at common themes. Now, I just finished telling you it's stupid to talk about Africa as one unified common place. So guess what we're going to start with? Unifying common characteristics. Only because I love being contradictory. There are some things that are relatively common throughout most parts of Africa. Now, notice the disclaimers. Relatively common in most parts of Africa. So again, it's still stupid to treat the entire continent as if it's one common country. But here are some things that we notice in multiple places in Africa at this time period. And again, what time period are we dealing with here? Post-classical. 600 through 1450. If you don't know these date ranges, this is something you want to keep track of. This might be a good thing to have in the front or back of your notebook, someplace easily accessible. And again, we can do all this later. You can look on Vision. I've already got the course laid out in those time periods, so you can pull the dates off of that. So, things that we see in multiple places in Africa. One of them, culturally, is that in many parts of Africa, there is a similar language base. Now, somebody explain to me the difference between similar language and similar language base.
What language are their languages evolved from?
Okay, good. So he'll add to that?
Most, wherever the economics are from.
All right, good. For example, the Romance languages, Italian, French, Spanish, all are derived from Latin.
And then Germanic languages.
Right.
English is kind of a mishmash. Both have seems more Romance language based, but grammar is more Germanic. Right?
You're right. English is kind of a mishmash of multiple linguistic origins.
Germanic is for sure, Romance is,
Mm-hmm. And again, because you look at all, and language is a funny way to look at history, because you can see who and how people have been influenced. And so what we see in Africa is that there is a language base called Bantu that influences the development of other African languages. And again, if you're close enough to share a language base, that probably brings with it other cultural characteristics as well. But again, it should not be interpreted as doing what? Creating uniformity. In other words, is all of Africa the same? No, because that is stupid. When we look at religion, and this really isn't unique to Africa, this is common for most places early on in civilization. What do most people believe makes the world go round? Spirits. And so in Africa, much like in many other parts of the world, we see a belief in animism, a belief in natural spirits. We do also see a belief in a monotheistic creator God. So again, Africa is not unified in its religious beliefs. Some parts of Africa develop belief in natural spirits. Some parts of Africa develop a belief in a single creator God. Not a Christian God, not a Muslim God, just a single God. Some parts of Africa practice ancestor worship, the belief that when our elders die, their spirits actually stay with us here in the mortal world, and they look out for us, kind of the angel on your shoulder. In some parts of Africa, Much like in Western Europe, there's a belief in magic. There's a belief in evil spirits. There's a belief in supernatural powers that the average person can't protect themselves from. Right. This requires the creation of a special class of people to combat that. In Africa, what do we call them? No. Witch doctors. And in many cases, these religious traditions and beliefs form the foundation of that society's laws. In other cases, society's laws are going to be separate from their religious beliefs. Can you guys think of a major civilization that fits that category, where laws and religious beliefs are separate?
Could you consider the Roman Republic/Empire?
Very good. You could consider the Roman Republic/Empire as an example of that. You've got the 12 tables providing society with uniform legal rules, and then you've got Zeus or Jupiter or whatever you want to call them messing around on Mount Olympus trying to make as many babies as possible. Clearly that is not your law code. Otherwise the first law would be, all right, men, go. Clearly that was not what Rome was founded on. After both of them, were raised by a wolf. So, again, strong foundation there.
We're both
All right.
God anyway.
Right. And then as far as economy goes, guess what? Like every other civilization we've found, major civilizations in Africa are based on agriculture. I know, it's shocking, right? Mind blown. Right. Right. But again, for Africa, and I'm glad you brought that up, Stephen, I mean, yes, bedrock principle for having civilization, right? You got to have a food surplus, which means you pretty much have to have farming. But when we think of Africa, what do we typically think of? We typically think of the Sahara. We typically think of the savannah. We think of the Nile. We think of rainforest. We think of people running around half naked in, little log huts, still being hunter-gatherers when the Europeans show up. Not true. Not true. Africa has major, sophisticated, advanced civilizations.
Non-wealthy spread out throughout.
Just as wealthy, if not more so than other existing civilizations, but you're right. But, and again, that brings up a great point, and this is where we have to look at our bias, like we started doing before. Is there civilization throughout Asia
Yes.
at this time? No. Where are your major civilizations in Asia?
China,
India, China.
and
It's spread throughout.
Yeah.
All right. Where's your major civilization in Eastern and Western Europe?
Yeah, that's
The Mediterranean. All right, so we don't have civilization spread evenly throughout the other continents, but we in the Western world have this bias that, well, all the rest of the world was pretty well sophisticated and advanced, but Africa, they were always behind. No. There were parts of Africa that were just as advanced as parts of the other continents. And there were parts of the other continents that were just as slow to develop as parts of Africa. We have to stop thinking of Africa as being fundamentally different from every place else because it's just not true. Yes.
Now, the people of West Africa, specifically Mali, are known for their mud buildings, specifically magnificent mosques out of mud.
Right?
Were those built out of necessity because they didn't have any stone, or they
Yeah.
didn't have a choice?
No, it's a lack of other available building materials. When you're in a desert climate or a semi-desert climate, it's not like there's all kinds of rocks and trees around to build stuff with. So you have to find alternate means of construction. Right, adobe. Question?
It's
You good?
pretty
Okay.
durable, as you can see in your the decorative areas.
Oh yeah, and I'm going to show you an example of a temple in Timbuktu that's still standing
From when?
from the Malian Empire.
Wow.
Yeah. What's this? It's a map of Africa. A's for everybody. Okay, what is on this map? And please don't say colors and words.
Climate zone.
Many colors and words.
Colors and words.
Okay, what do the colors represent? Not civilizations, not empires. Not groups of people, but we're getting closer. Not regions, not cultures, but we're getting closer. Language. Good job. 2 people at once. And that took not nearly as long as it usually does. Even better. All right. Bantu. You know that word. It's probably the only word on here that you do know, other than Congo maybe. So look at the orange. This entire area is influenced by Bantu. Now, if you look at the coding, Niger-Congo A and Niger-Congo B, red and orange, happen to be very close to each other. There's a fair number of people that think that the Bantu language actually originated in Western Africa and that there was a great migration of Bantu peoples that moved eastward and brought the language with them, and that language and culture was disseminated throughout other parts of Africa.
And destroy this section bridge between the green right there.
Right, and so again, it's not like it's, a conquest where it's wiping people out. It's cultural diffusion. Now, other interesting things to note. Why is up here different from down here? The Sahara.
North Africa was more influenced.
It's the Sahara. It's the Sahara. It's the Sahara. What's the easier direction to go if you are here? It's easier to move lateral and south than walk through the desert for no good reason. So North Africa would develop differently than sub-Saharan Africa. Because who wants to cross a desert? For those that are spelling challenged, that's why there's 1 S and not 2. Desert is 2 because you want more. Desert is 1 because you only want to do it once, if that. Yes, sir. There is. We have an area called the Sahel, which is kind of a fringe between the desert and the more temperate parts of Africa. Yes, sir.
Why was there no remaining traces of Latin or Mediterranean languages in North Africa after the Muslims came in and converted most of the...
Because this map is from long, long before Greece and Rome. Because, again, Africa has had people in it since the dawn of civilization. Where did they think most people came out of? Africa.
I was going to say, that's the only fundamental difference between Africa and other continents. People originated in Africa according to what we know.
Right.
Americans tell and moved elsewhere.
Exactly. So again, hopefully you're noticing now that you have some biases with regards to Africa. So take them out, look at them, and then either shove the good ones back in or kick the bad ones out. We have trash cans up front for those that need to throw away their biases. Okay, time to start learning the compare-contrast essay. You have your packet out next to you. What we are going to work on today are direct comparisons. We are going to work on avoiding that tempting dump truck of information. We want narrowly focused ideas. So, one way that early Africa and early China are similar is that they both, what? Had ancestor worship. All right, valid. Are there other valid options? And here's something else you need to realize. There's never one right answer here. These questions are written to allow a variety of options. So, one valid option, ancestor worship. Emily. All right, parts of Africa are geographically isolated, just like China, because of, in Africa's case, the Sahara. In China's case, the Gobi Desert, the Himalayas, and eventually the construction of the wall.
They also had a variety of lingual bases.
Okay.
They had a variety of languages, although China came from one state, or one or smaller state, and Africa came from a slightly larger group.
Okay, so in both cases, they both have a variety of languages early on. Now, if we wanted to also address differences, could we do something with differences?
Yeah.
All right, China develops a unified language. Does Africa? No, because it's not a unified country. Africa also isn't unified. Right. Yes, sir.
Since were created to be unified even if it's spoken differently throughout the region.
Mm-hmm.
Is that similar to how we have words written down but pronounced differently, like dialect in
Yep.
America?
Exactly.
Like stereotypical Southern accent.
Yep.
Y'all.
Exactly. Versus Western or Northern or Midwestern or whatever. Okay, now the other thing you need to get used to is not just stopping with the comparison, but explaining why it existed. So let's take the very first one. Let's take Stevens. Because they both practiced ancestor worship. Africa and China are similar in that they both practiced ancestor worship. Why would that similarity exist? Stop and think for a second. Why? Why would both of these areas, separated by thousands of miles, engage in a similar practice? Stephen? Okay, because both societies had an early belief in natural spirits. Yeah. That explains why the similarity exists. What else, Nick?
Because they didn't have a large organizing religion to tell them what to do.
Good. They both practice ancestor worship because neither had a major religion to provide explanations. Both are correct. But do you see that you're getting here in the habit now of identifying a similarity and explaining the similarity, providing evidence? If we don't include the because, if we simply say Africa and China are similar in that they both practiced ancestor worship, is that fact or opinion? That's opinion. I could say Africa and China are similar in that they both rode cows. Somebody want to argue that with me? Bring it.
Cows are not native to certain areas of Africa, so it would not be anything. And cows are also not native to China. And also, it is very hard to ride a cow. Much harder than to ride a horse or a camel.
That doesn't mean they didn't ride them. Just because it's harder doesn't mean they didn't do it. And there are water buffalo and wildebeest and cow-like creatures in both of them. So take that.
Water buffalo and wildebeest are not cows.
They are cow-like. I was using the term loosely. Hey, I can't help that you're biased towards American, milk cows. All right, do you understand the problem here? If I stop it at they both rode cows and don't provide any of the evidence, it's my opinion. There's no fact. If I say they both worship their ancestors and don't provide examples, I could be totally wrong. You can't just make the similarity. You have to prove the similarity. Yes. Right. Because, for example, a particular instance would be, right, all of those phrases will help lead you down the path towards fact. And that's what we want. All right, another one. Let's try differences now. One way that early Africa is different from early India is that in, which place do we want to start with?
India.
Okay, in India they what? Had a social hierarchy. While in Africa, what's the assumption? They did not. Prove it. Now, before we do that, what are some other options? How could we compare India and early Africa in terms of differences? Stephen? Can you prove it? Great example. Right. All right. I want to use this example. India was influenced by outside invaders, while in Africa they weren't? Question mark. I'm not sure, but I know there's stuff about the Aryans, and man, I want to write about that because I know it, and it's good evidence. If you can't prove the difference on both sides, don't do it. Because what if you're wrong? You invalidate the entire difference. Hannah?
India have like many religions.
Good. India has a unifying religion while Africa does not. This is because India has Hinduism, while Africa has a variety of religions because they're not a unified country. Nick?
Also, India had a variety of different no, that doesn't work.
That'd be a similarity. Good. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Yes, that's one way, but then you're still going to want to elaborate on the comparison itself. Why does India have a major religion and Africa doesn't? So it's fine to insert the fact there, but you still want to explain the connection. But that's good. Yes?
How do you say M-Y-R-A-I-D? I mean I-A-D?
Are you trying to do myriad?
Yeah, that's it.
M-I-R.
M-I-R.
Yeah. I-A-D. All right, so this is... Yes, exactly. This is an introduction to comparative statements. We're going to do more. Back to the notes. Let's talk about religion in Africa since we were just on the topic. We already talked about early African religious beliefs, animism, ancestor worship, beliefs in magic. Now we want to talk about post-classical Africa. And Africa is exposed to the major world religions through trade. Yes. Okay. On this map down here at the bottom, you have a sense of where these different world religions go. Islam spreads across northern and western Africa. Christianity holds up pretty much here in northeastern Africa. Islam later spreads down the eastern coast. And again, this is primarily done through trade. How does trade spread religion? Sahel?
Like merchants go around, like, buying and like as they do it, they instead of just selling, they actually talk with with their sellers, actually have a conversation, and eventually like tell them their
Build relations and they learn news.
Yep. Because merchants are going to travel to the same places.
They're going to build relations with people and share news of what's going on here, what's going on where.
Right. And because they travel to the same places, they build relationships with people in those specific villages and towns that they pass through. You know, they'll get to know the innkeeper. They'll get to know the guy that they can buy food from. They'll get to know the guy that can fix their wagon or help their animals if they're sick. And so over time, over numerous trips, they will eventually, establish a relationship. It's like the people that go to Starbucks every morning. What eventually happens as soon as you walk in the door?
You get to know the people.
They know you, and they know what your drink is, and they start pouring it before you even get up to the register. Yes.
That's kind of what happens with GameStop in the mall.
They know you now?
Or my family.
Okay. Right. Anytime you make the same trip to the same stores or the same places, you establish that common bond. And so eventually you get to know these people and you talk about things other than what you came to buy. You ask them how their family is. You ask them what they do for a living because you're kind of curious because you always see them. And as this rapport builds, religion probably comes up. And so imagine a Muslim merchant coming into some place in West Africa talking to, a guy that believes in the traditional tribal religions. And they start talking about faith and the guy's like, I'm totally committed, to my faith and my God, Allah. And this African guy who's buying his stuff is like, wait, what? Who? I've never heard of that God. Which one's he? I mean, I've got this God, this God, this God, this God, and this God, but who's your God? And the Muslim guy's like, wait a minute, how many gods do you have? Because based on what I know, there's one God. My God. So I'm confused. Let's talk about this. And then, they're talking about their basic beliefs, and, the African guy's talking about all, ancestor worship and these natural spirits that control the world. The Muslim guy's looking at him like, man, you're nuts. Let me tell you about what I believe. And so over time, these ideas tend to blend and merge. And maybe the African guy goes home and he's like, wow, I kind of like that guy's religion. I want to learn more. That's how religion spreads through trade. It's not like a one-stop shop where he walks in the door in Africa and he's like, boom, let me set up my Muslim shop. Here's my Muslim God, here's my Muslim Quran, here's my Muslim prayer rug, buy it now. That's not what we're doing. He's selling his normal wares, normal items. But over the course of time, conversations about religion take place. Stephen? That's what happens all over the place. That's how Buddhism and Islam spread into Southeast Asia. It's how Christianity spreads throughout Europe. Trade and conquest are typically the two ways that religions spread, and by far the more popular way is through trade, because it's easier to do something voluntarily than when somebody is holding a sword to your throat.
Are there any major polytheistic religions today?
Nope. And maybe Hinduism, but again, Hinduism...
So kind of iffy on whether it's polytheistic or just
Right.
different aspects of it.
Exactly. Nick?
How did the Christians in East Africa still remain Christians after the Arabs incorporated that into their empire?
Because once you're introduced to a major religion, something that is unifying, something that you share now with hundreds or thousands of other people, it's very hard to abandon that faith and voluntarily swap it out for something new. Also remember that when the Arabs were conquering, they were not conquering with the express purpose of converting. And so when they come into Northeast Africa, they're not going to persecute Christians. They're not going to come in and say, all right, you had your shot with Christianity, good run for a couple hundred years, you're done, you're going to be Muslim now. They're not doing that.
They said that it wasn't Christians introduced, they told people that
Exactly. So if you need countries to hang all this information on, Northeast Africa, we're talking about present-day Ethiopia and Nubia. In West Africa, we're talking about Ghana, Mali, and eventually what will become the Empire of Songhai. And again, we threw out this word earlier. This is a word you need to know for the remainder of your natural lives. Syncretism is the fusion of any two religions, not just Islam, but the fusion of any two religious practices. So some of these African kings will adopt Islam, but they don't want to rock the boat and ruin, the tribal relationships. They don't want to alienate the witch doctors, which are their advisors. And so they will continue to keep many of the tribal practices, but they might start calling God Allah. They might change the way that they worship to include the traditional Muslim style of praying in the direction of Mecca and perhaps even kneeling down and praying, which maybe they didn't do in their traditional worship. Jasmine. Syncretism is the fusion of two religious traditions to create something new.
or just change parts of it.
Right.
It's still recognizable as religion, but as the same religion, but
Right. Change parts of it to make it fit what you do, to make it fit your lifestyle. Sahil? Okay. Let me know if you think of it. All right, so here again, we're seeing another example of why we can't treat Africa as one unified whole. Because it's not. Parts become more associated with Islamic culture. Some become more associated with Christian culture. And then look, there's a whole swath in the middle
That's still
that doesn't do either.
because they're happy with their current religion.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And again, that happened in Europe too. Just because Christianity spread into Europe in the 3 and 4 and 5 and 600s and 700s and 800s.
not everyone converted, not everyone was influenced by it.
Right. You still had people out in the countryside believing in magic. You still had the Druids in Stonehenge, practicing their traditional Druidic culture and not buying the whole Christian thing. You still had people that were firmly convinced that magic and wizards were a real part of life and had to be dealt with, despite the fact that you had churches just down the road. So,
But were they, since like Christian and Islam pretty take everything, but like a majority, were they shunned in society?
Depends on where they were.
well, it depends more on what time.
Yeah.
Because as conversions would take place and as cultures would blend, as syncretism would start, you may in some cases immediately shun people that don't jump on board, or there may be a long, slow period of adoption. It really is going to depend on when and where.
Excuse me?
1 second. Nick?
Did Judaism ever really gain a hold in Africa, or is it not?
Not as a dominant religion. There will be people that adopt the Jewish faith, but it will never become the most popular religion in any one particular area.
Is there a reason why it just didn't really catch on?
Partly because Judaism is not only a religion, but it's also an ethnicity. You need to, depending again on the branch of Judaism, you need to be born into the Jewish faith. Some branches of Judaism do not accept converts, or their conversion practices are very, very strict and very, very tough. And they do not have the same, open arm mentality that early Islam and Christianity do, where they want people to come to their faith. The Jewish community, especially because they were already several thousand years into the diaspora, where they'd been scattered from their homeland and fighting for survival, that doesn't necessarily make you want to buddy up with everybody you meet.
Wasn't it like until somewhere in the 20th century that Israel was made a proper country again, or a proper nation?
1947, 6, 7, 8.
48 was when they got
It's right after World War II.
So running on 50-something years.
Yeah, relatively new. Okay, we are almost out of time, so this will be the last thing we tackle. When we look at government in Africa, again, lots of variety. In some cases, we have clan systems, which sounds a lot like who? The Bedouin. Good. And eventually, many of these clan systems would turn into a unified state or civilization. Now, some of these unified states would adopt Islam because the ruler liked the idea that Islam would give him even more power and authority by becoming a caliph, someone with both political and spiritual authority. And then in Africa, we also have not just states, but we also have some groups that we call stateless societies. These are societies without a formal government. How does that work?
Honor system, of course.
Kind of. Really, it's a community of equals. And so you might have the heads of the families get together every so often in secret, which is part of where the secret society part comes. And they're not going to have, public, transparent meetings. They're all going to get together at night after the kids have been put to bed and gather in somebody's house and quietly go about deciding on what should or should not or could happen, and the parts of society may or may not execute those decisions. So there's an upside and a downside to this. Would a stateless society need to collect taxes? Maybe, maybe not. They might decide to, they might decide not to. But here's the downside. If the society as a whole suddenly has a need for funds, what's the downside?
They might not be able to gather together.
You might not be able to get them, right?
So, taxes would be an honor system, of course.
Quite possibly. Right, and again, there is no clear-cut rule here, so we don't really know what would happen. Similarly, if there is an external threat, if there's the threat of invasion, is there a standing army in a stateless society? No, because there would be no government to control it.
You would need rulers or equals to work together and
To all agree on the best course of action to either fight or defend or not. So again, at that point, you're relying on decision-making under duress.
or it could be something like even stateless, they could have a majority rule but among the equal group.
But that would still be heading in the direction of government.
Yeah, but isn't a unanimous also some sort of government? Also?
Potentially. Emily? They could, but again, the problem with the militia is you need somebody in charge of it.
Couldn't they be just loyal to their generals, like what you had in the Roman?
But even with the general, that's a position of authority.
Then you'd have overthrows like Rome did with the generals. They weren't loyal to the state anymore.
That is one.
Is that like stateless
Right. Again, if there's a general consensus, and again, if they are a community, they're probably going to respond the same way to a threat. So there's probably not a danger, but by the same token, you don't have that standing trained army already in existence. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just different. All right, so next class we're going to finish up both with Chapter 8 and with some more of this compare and contrast stuff. You are welcome to tackle some of this on your own if you want to try to practice compare and contrast. If you want to wait, you can wait. That's fine too.